What's going on, everybody? Welcome into today's Denver Broncos positional deep dive video where we unveil our number 10 ranked position for the Denver Broncos heading into the 2024 season. We are just 12 days away from the first open practice of Denver Broncos training camp. And just in case you guys are unfamiliar with how this series works, we go through each and every position group for the Denver Broncos and rank them from weakest to strongest. And we basically break down each and every single player and what he brings to this team, what his role is supposed to be heading into 2024. Obviously, things can change as we get into training camp, get through preseason, and actually get into the regular season. Guys could have different roles than anticipated. But this is a really good exercise to sort of familiarize ourselves with this Broncos roster as we head into training camp. So today, we unveil our number 10 ranked position group, and it's a position group that, looking at it and thinking about it being the second to last ranked position group on the team, I know some people are already calling me crazy, but as I said yesterday in kind of a teaser, this is a position group that has potential to raise way higher up that list. They could go easily into the top 5, maybe even the top 3, but right now there are a lot of question marks with this position group, and I just feel like right now they have a lot to prove, and that is the running back position. And it all starts right at the top with the presumed starter at that position in Javonte Williams, and there are a lot of question marks surrounding Javonte Williams, and this is very much a prove-it year for him heading into 2024. So, without further ado, let's get into Javonte Williams, and right off the bat, he had a very gruesome knee injury. He suffered that injury in week 4 of 2022 against the Raiders. It was a torn ACL, torn LCL, and torn posterior lateral corner. I just want to praise him for the fact that he was able to play in all 17 games last year. He didn't miss a single game. He was out for a good chunk of the Chicago Bears game because of a minor injury, but he still started that game technically, and he did not miss a single game besides that Bears game this year. So the fact that he was able to do that, hats off to you, Javonte, seriously. Last year, stat-wise, 217 carries, 774 yards, 3.6 yards per carry, 3 touchdowns, 1 fumble. However, things started to kind of go downhill for Javonte Williams as we got further and further into the season. The final 4 games, the stats from those games reflect that. 47 carries, 124 yards, 2.6 yards per carry, 2 touchdowns. Receiving game in those final 4 games, 17 targets, 15 receptions, 48 yards, 3.2 yards per carry, no receiving, or yards per reception, I should say, and no receiving touchdowns. And that comes after having a pretty good, or at least decent year receiving prior to that point. He had 228 total yards through the air, which isn't spectacular or anything, but that's at least decent. And in those final 4 games, he only had 48 receiving yards. So that means that he really struggled to generate any production through the air in those final games, and it was even worse on the ground, only averaging 2.6 yards per carry. He really ran out of gas, it felt like, as we got further and further into the year. And injuries aside, there are still some question marks about Javonte Williams' game. Obviously, pre-injury, he was a hard-nosed runner, always fought for those extra yards, would drag defenders with him for several yards. That was kind of the MO of Javonte Williams' game. But he still had question marks about vision, and those question marks linger to this day. Sometimes he'll run into a brick wall and miss a hole for a really easy gain. Other times, he'll hit the wrong hole. He'll hit a hole and gain 3-4 yards instead of hitting the hole that could have potentially gained him 20-plus yards. Javonte Williams has to answer those question marks about his overall vision and his footwork because that led to a relative lack of production last year. Obviously, the injury kind of compounded those issues, but Javonte still has to be able to showcase that he can do some of the things that he needs to do in order to be a true superstar running back in the NFL. And sometimes recovering from these multi-ligament knee injuries is really, really tough. There's a chance that, as much as I hate to say this, Javonte Williams may not ever be the same player. And I really hope that he is able to recapture at least some form that's close to his pre-injury self in 2021, because that was a player that the Broncos and Broncos country in turn had a lot of optimism about. But as time has gone on and these injuries have kind of deteriorated his overall level of play, there's some question marks about Javonte Williams. He's heading into a contract year, and if he's unable to return to some close level that's near his 2021 production, then I just don't see a scenario where Javonte Williams ends up being a Denver Bronco beyond this year. In fact, if he struggles throughout training camp to the point where it's very clear that Aundre Eese is going to be RB1, or maybe even one of the other backs that we're going to mention in this video, then maybe the Broncos give Javonte Williams some opportunities to explore other pastures and maybe give him the opportunity to play elsewhere. Maybe they trade him. Maybe they cut him. I don't know if it's going to be that drastic, but I am going to say that there is a greater than zero chance that that could happen, just because Javonte Williams, as the season went on last year, really, really struggled. And again, I want to just give him a lot of praise for being able to make it through the whole season and not miss any games aside from that Chicago Bears game. And that alone is very, very impressive. But he's got to be able to showcase that he's somewhat close to back to his pre-injury self. If not, Javonte Williams, I'm afraid his days in Denver might be numbered. And the Broncos did prepare themselves for the event that Javonte Williams is not able to return to his pre-injury self, and they sort of bought themselves an insurance policy by drafting Aundre Eese in the 5th round. He was drafted out of Notre Dame, 148th overall. Just some measurables on him, just to refamiliarize yourselves. 5'11", 227 pounds. One thing that did maybe tank his stock a little bit in the draft was he didn't test extraordinarily well at the combine. His 40-yard dash in particular, he ran a 4.7 140, which was the worst 40-yard dash time of any of the running backs that were at the combine. However, you look at his tape, and he certainly is a lot faster than a 4.7 player. Stat-wise for him, he had 204 attempts in 2023 at Notre Dame, 1,341 yards, 18 touchdowns, 1 fumble. Not much production through the air, 17 targets, 17 receptions, 142 yards, no touchdowns. He's a strong downhill runner with good vision between the tackles. So I really do feel like that is akin to the run scheme that the Denver Broncos like to run. They like to run a lot of power run schemes. They like to run up the gut. Not to say that they won't run outside zone or stuff like that. They will, but Sean Payton really likes to run between the tackles, and Aundre Eese gives you the ability to do that, but he also is really good in zone schemes as well. He received a 90.6 Pro Football Focus grade in each category, zone runs as well as power runs, and so that showcases that he has the ability to do both. That was top 4 in both of those categories. He's also a fairly strong asset as a pass protector, 63.6 overall PFF pass blocking grade last year, which is pretty solid at the end of the day for a running back. So I really do feel like Aundre Eese does almost everything that you need a starting running back in the NFL to do. He could very easily end up out-snapping somebody like Javonte Williams or even Samaje Perine, just because he's able to bring you production in multiple different areas of the field. However, not so much in the passing game. That, aside from being a pass protector, not so much in the receiving game, I should really say. That is one concern. He's also really, really good at dragging defenders. He had 892 yards after contact last year, which is higher than Javonte Williams' 588 yards after contact last year. So that is something to take into account. Granted, of course, Estime played at the college level against lower-end defenders, especially at a school like Notre Dame that's non-conferenced, and they played against some pretty wacky random opponents, honestly. But do with that information what you will. I do feel like Aundre Eese, his game has a chance to translate to the NFL level at a really, really high level. And at the end of the day, the Broncos felt that he could be a significant asset to this offense, enough to spend a 5th-round draft pick on him. That's pretty premium value for a running back in today's modern NFL. So I really think that this is a move that should put Javonte Williams on notice, and to an extent Samaje Perine as well. But we're going to talk about Perine. I do think that he's got a niche role that does serve himself well on this team, but I'm really, really excited to see what Aundre Eese is able to do throughout training camp and heading into the preseason. Obviously, he kind of suffered that minor injury there in the offseason, but he should be good to go by the time we get to training camp. All right, so as far as Samaje Perine is concerned, again, I think that he does fill a niche role very well for this team. He was very easily Denver's best pass-catching back in 2023. 53 targets, 50 receptions, 455 yards, 9.1 yards per reception, no touchdowns through the air. On the ground, he had 53 carries for 238 yards, 4.5 yards per carry, 1 touchdown, 3 fumbles, just 155 yards after contact, so not exactly great there. He's got decent speed, power, and vision as a runner, but part of the reason why his yards per carry is so high is because he mostly played on later downs here in Denver. He played mostly on pass downs because he was the 3rd down back. He was the 2-minute drill back primarily here in Denver, and he played against lighter defensive fronts. Defenses were more worried about stopping the pass, so they had more DBs on the field, more smaller bodies on the field. They weren't trying to load the box as much to stop the run on earlier downs when guys like Javonte Williams were on the field. So that is one contributing factor, I feel like, to Samaje Perine having 4.5 yards per carry last year. He did have quite a few pass blocking snaps last year for the Denver Broncos, and I thought that he was pretty decent at it looking at his tape, but Pro Football Focus was not impressed with his pass blocking last year. He had a 31.1 pass blocking grade. He had 54 pass block snaps, gave up 2 sacks, 3 hits, 3 hurries, and 8 pressures. So looking at it from that perspective, that's not exactly good. This is exactly why I always talk about you gotta watch the film and look at the numbers and marry them all together to come up with your opinion. And this is why sometimes the tape and the numbers can tell you something completely different. And looking at it from this value, yeah, that's not exactly great pass protection production. Try saying that 5 times fast from Samaje Perine. I do feel like if somebody like a Jalil McLaughlin or a Blake Watson can fill the role as a receiver for Samaje Perine, particularly in 2-minute drill, and Aundre Eese can maybe fill his role as a pass protector, Perine could become expendable. Remember, the Broncos can save $3.5 million if they were to release Samaje Perine. Maybe they were to do it as a cap casualty as we get to the end of training camp. Again, not saying that's guaranteed to happen or anything like that, but it is definitely something to keep an eye on. Alright, so let's move into Jalil McLaughlin. I am on the record stating that I am the president of the Jalil McLaughlin fan club, and I do feel like Jalil brought really nice juice to Denver's run game last year as a change of pace back. He had 76 carries for 410 yards, 5.4 yards per carry, which is very impressive, along with a touchdown. Through the air, 36 targets, 31 receptions, 160 yards, 5.2 yards per reception, along with 2 touchdowns, 257 yards after contact. He's only 5'9" and 197 pounds. You can't really expect a running back of that size to be an impact player as a pass protector, and that was reflective in his pass blocking grade, 34.6, which ironically enough is actually higher than Samaje Perine's is. But he's a very explosive runner and only needs a small crease, a very small little gap to find, and he's one cut and he's gone, man. He can bring explosive runs to your run game, and I think that he's a big play waiting to happen and wasn't given as many opportunities as I felt like he should have gotten to give those big plays in the run game. In the pass game, again, there's just not a whole lot outside of passes behind the line of scrimmage for Jalil McLaughlin. Most of his receptions, 21 of 31 of them in fact, were behind the line of scrimmage. Some of that was due to inaccuracy from Russell Wilson on screen passes and stuff like that, swing routes. But part of it is also because McLaughlin is just limited in his route tree and the routes that he is able to run. I think that could pigeonhole him into just sort of a small role only on early downs as a pure runner. And I don't know if the Denver Broncos want to utilize a roster spot on a one-trick pony. He does that one trick extremely well, but if you're not an asset in pass protection, you're not an asset on special teams, and you're not an asset in the receiving game, then Jalil McLaughlin might actually, unfortunately, be in danger of not making this team, especially because we're going to talk about another player here in a second, in Blake Watson. I think Watson could be sort of the next step up, the upgrade from Jalil McLaughlin, just because of some of the things that he is able to do. I love Jalil. I think he's an awesome person, and I think he's a really good player, but it's almost the Philip Lindsay conversation where, do you want to invest those resources and invest a roster spot in a player who's only really good at running the football, and defenses are going to know that basically it's going to be a run and McLaughlin is going to get the ball every time he's on the field because he can't pass protect, his route running's limited. It's just tough, man. I love Jalil and I want him to stay here in Denver, but I could see a scenario where the team wants to invest those resources, that roster spot, into somebody who's a little bit more versatile. And that player could very well end up being Blake Watson. Watson was an undrafted free agent that the Denver Broncos signed out of Memphis this past April. He's got very similar build to Jalil McLaughlin. 5'9", 197 pounds, 4.39 40-yard dash. That was ran at his pro day. What separates him from Jalil McLaughlin, they're very similar runners, but it's the receiving game. A lot more snaps as a slot receiver for Blake Watson. He's able to run a lot more routes, sometimes from the slot, sometimes out of the backfield. He had a much more versatile route tree than Jalil McLaughlin. He only had 9 receptions that were behind the line of scrimmage last year. Out of, it was, what was it? I'm trying to find it on my notes. I'm sorry. 50 catches. I had to write it on the side. I missed it. It was 50 catches. Only 9 of them were behind the line of scrimmage last year. So I think that because of his value that he could bring as a slot receiver, more of a receiving back out of the backfield, he's got the same problem that Jalil McLaughlin has, where you can't really utilize him as a pass protector because of his small frame. But again, I think just because of that greater versatility in the receiving game, that could lead the Broncos to keeping a guy like Blake Watson over a guy like a Jalil McLaughlin. That's something to definitely keep an eye on. In the rushing game last year, Blake Watson was very impressive. 177 attempts, 1,044 yards, 5.9 yards per carry, 14 touchdowns, 2 fumbles, and was solid as a receiver as well. 56 targets, 50 catches, 461 yards, 9.2 yards per reception, and 3 touchdowns. And again, some of those snaps came out of the slot, and some of those snaps came out of the backfield. it's going to be a really interesting decision and a very tough competition between Jalil McLaughlin and Blake Watson. And the Broncos are probably going to have to make a really tough decision between those two players as to which one to keep. Because the Broncos are also going to have to take into account Mike Burton, the fullback. Mike Burton is basically a lock to make this team. He's really good on special teams. He had 289 special team snaps last year. That alone justifies his roster spot. But he might even bring a bigger impact on special teams this year because of the new kickoff rules, where teams are going to be looking for bigger bodies to contribute in sort of that line set formation on the new kickoffs. I think that Mike Burton is going to fill that role beautifully. Offensively, he didn't really do a whole lot outside of blocking. He was really solid as a pass blocker, had an 84 pass blocking grade from PFF, 61.9 run block grade. That's solid enough from a fullback. Again, a position that's really a dying breed in the NFL for all intents and purposes. He only had 3 catches, 8 yards, 7 carries, 4 yards, or 7 carries, 9 yards, excuse me. Trying to read my little chicken scratch handwriting here. 1.3 yards per carry. So, not really a big impact player on offense outside of, obviously, blocking. But special teams, big impact. That is why Mike Burton is going to be here. I do think the Denver Broncos are going to end up keeping 3 to 4 running backs plus Mike Burton, the fullback. It's going to be interesting to see if they do want to keep Samperine as well as Blake Watson or Jalil McLaughlin. That's where the big decision is going to come between those two guys. If they only want to keep 3 pure running backs, then somebody like Samperine or maybe even a Javonte Williams could be on their way out the door. So the Denver Broncos are going to have a lot of big-time decisions to make here in the next coming weeks as we get through training camp and get through the preseason. And just like I said earlier, this is a position group that has a lot of question marks right now, but they could very easily answer those question marks, and they could become one of the top position groups on this team. I could see that happening very realistically. All right, Broncos country, let me know in the comment section below. Who do you think is going to ultimately emerge as the top running back for the Denver Broncos? Who do you think is going to lead the team in rushing? And who do you think is going to be the top receiving back out of the backfield for this team? Drop those comments down below, guys. I would love to hear your thoughts, as always. Be sure to leave a like on this video as well as subscribe and ring the bell so these videos appear in your notification feed. I would really appreciate it, guys. Those are 2 free and easy ways to show your support. Helps tell YouTube's algorithm to push us out and helps us get seen by more and more members of Broncos country just like you and me. And until next time, guys, I am your host, Gage Madrid, saying peace out.